Thanks everybody for attending our sequence. So welcome back. First of all, let me say, and we're excited today to have a Sumit to talk about the India demonetization, and afterwards, Filippo will discuss Sumit's paper. Sumit, the floor is yours. Can you share the screen?
Thank you, Bernie and Jigwat, for having our paper on this seminar series. I mean, it's a great series. I've attended some of them and I really like the paper, especially last week was great. Sorry, a few weeks ago was a great paper, great discussant. So I'm looking forward to Filippo's discussion of our paper as well. So this is, the paper is titled Digital Payments and Consumption. We are going to use the demonetization in India in 2016 as kind of a natural experiment to look at the role of digital payments. So this is joint work with Pulak and Jing and Tianyue. I really want to thank Tianyue, who has worked extremely hard on this paper and done all the work. I'm just presenting it and taking credit for it right now. Let me try to motivate this as follows. You know, I have pretty much most of my life been using cash. And, you know, every time I kind of go into my wallet, I feel like money leaving and I become more stingy spending that money. And now I have a almost 2-year-old son who will go to the supermarket with me and he will literally walk around with my credit card and he doesn't think at all. He thinks the whole store is his. He can just buy anything because he thinks we pay by this plastic card. Now that's a very unfair comparison because I'm comparing my son to myself. My son doesn't even earn anything, so he thinks all money just grows on trees. So the right thought experiment is when I use cash versus if I could use credit, will I change my behavior in my thinking? So that's what we are trying to get at right now. So we know digital payments have been really growing around the world. Just to give you a sense, in developing economies, digital payments between 2014 and 17 have grown by around 11%. A lot of it that has to do with the demonetization in India, which kind of created, the JDY, this was this push in India to get digital payments adoption. And they kind of adopted around 500 million people in India got digital payment access through this debit card because the government was pushing this idea. The idea typically goes back to this development economics. It improves efficiency of making payments, enhances security, transparency, and provide first entry point into formal financial system. I've worked on other papers where I've shown that access to finance through this digital payment or banking will help you get loans, will help you improve your credit worthiness, and essentially help your overall well-being. I mean, Ross Levine has kind of written on this for a long time. Ken Rogoff has also been kind of making this argument that digital payments are really good and they can overcome a bunch of these costs cost of carrying cash and fraud and other things. Okay. Governments have been pushing this. In India, they started this RuPay, which is one nation, one RuPay. There are other kind of ways of paying through digital payments. So the question we want to ask in this paper is, what does this mean towards digital payment? Can this actually affect consumption? Now, there could be multiple mechanisms at play. I'm not going to really get into that much. I'm going to talk about it at the very end. If it's transaction cost, the way I'm thinking about transaction cost is that essentially by paying by cash, you know, you have to go to an ATM machine, you have to carry cash. There is this whole literature on demand for money, and also, you know, theft and other things. The second mechanism could be more behavioral about salience and essentially how salient cash is. I mean, cash is very salient. As I started out with my presentation, when cash leaves my wallet, I really feel the pinch of it. Whereas my son, I mean, he really doesn't care because he's just using a plastic card and he thinks this plastic card is always available and there is no depletion of money on this card. So empirical challenges are a lot in this literature. Consumers obviously do not have equal access to digital payments. Merchants are also not willing to provide digital payments to everybody. Some merchants are unwilling to take digital payments because there is a startup cost for merchants, around $2,000 to $3,000 to set up the machine. Even if we actually assume that we can set up the merchants and consumers are willing to take on these things, to find the right thought experiment where we can actually make them choose between cash and credit is not easy to find. So there is some work being done on this area by some experimental research using debit cards and trying to show if it increases willingness to pay. But these experiments are very limited in their shape and how they are done. So what we want to do is we want to use this demonetization in India, which was an exogenous forcing of people's choice of mode of payment. Essentially, it took away cash in India and forced people to use this alternate means of either wallets, debit, or credit. And then we will bring in a large administrative data set to track consumption of individuals both before and after the demonetization exercise. So here again, going back to my very simple example between me and my son, now we are going to start looking at me before versus me after. What do I do in terms of my spending when I don't have cash in my wallet anymore? Okay. So just to give you a background of this demonetization, it happened in November 2016. On November 8th, the Indian Prime Minister actually went on TV. I think it was 9 p.m. Pulak may kind of know better because he was in India. My mom was in India and she called me immediately and said, look, all this money that I have at home, what will I do with it? What will happen? So, I mean, it was a commotion all over India that they removed around all the 500 and 1,000 rupee notes, and they became invalid after midnight that same day. The purpose of this was to flush out black money and combat tax evasion, counterfeiting, terrorism. There were a bunch of reasons. There's a literature now, growing literature on what really happened with demonetization. We are really not into that. We will try to tell you what happened as a result of it on consumer behavior. New notes, it took a while, maybe around a month before they were available in India. So this demonetization essentially took away around 86% of this transactions. So of this paper money was gone out of circulation in India. And a lot of the transactions that were happening in India were happening through cash before that. Our discussant has talked about that. So different countries have different value of how much cash is in circulation as a fraction of the GDP. Now, this demonetization exercise in India was not the first, and I'm not guessing it's not the last. Many countries have done it. India itself has done this twice before, in 1946 and in 1978, where they have removed money out of circulation and brought in new currency. What is new or special about this was the large scope of the way the Indian government did this. And there was no expectation. It was suddenness of the announcement. And there was this prolonged unavailability of the new notes. I guess bullet 2 and 3 go together. Because it was suddenness of the announcement, that's why it took a while to bring in the new notes. In the past, what happens in other countries, even in India, people were expecting, or there was leakage of this information. And the reason there was leakage is because they were already planning to put out this currency out there. Okay. Obviously, this created huge issues in India. There were technical disruptions. The first issue was the ATM machines that they had built were for the larger bill size, but the newer bills that they were issuing were smaller. And so the ATM machines were not properly equipped to kind of give them out. So that created some delay in they had to retrofit all these ATM machines. There were obviously storage issues. So I'm not going to get into this, but what you really see is that this graph essentially kind of summarizes it, what happened in India and payment mode. Cash actually dropped, as you can see, from the kind of a first top line, from around 70% to around 50%, and gradually it came back up. Debit cards actually took off. And one of the reasons debit card really took off is because of this Jan Dhan Yojana that was happening before this demonetization exercise. And this really helped in India on how debit cards were working to grow over anyway. Credit card, you really don't see much movement at all. It is pretty flat. There was some uptick during the demonetization exercise, but not as much. Okay. So the data that we will try to use here is to look at administrative data from one large supermarket chain in India. This is the 4th largest supermarket chain. It's also the 3rd largest private sector business group. It has around 530 stores across India. In our sample, we are only using 170 from the larger districts, not from the smaller districts, because the chain doesn't operate in some of the villages and small towns. Obviously, they are worth quite a large. I mean, they are worth around 520 million in revenues per year in India. The sample period we are using is from April 2016 to September 2017. Look, we can't really do this kind of exercise just by looking at debit card or credit card receipts, because that's receipt level information. That also only tells you at which store you went to buy. We really need actually purchase level information here. What is the amount you were paying for each product that you were buying? What was the payment mode that you have? So if you use just debit card, we really don't know. I mean, what is the alternative you would have used there? So we know the receipt amount, the payment mode, the details of the purchase. So if you bought biscuits or chocolates, we actually know exactly the chocolates that you bought and how much you bought, how much was the price, how much was the taxes, and what is the quantity you bought. Okay. Here is some summary stats that kind of tells you the whole story itself. Cash payments dropped from 72% to 60% before to after. Debit card went up from 22% to 32%. If you look at other mobile wallets, they really didn't move that much. I mean, mobile wallets in India was not that big before demonetization, even though now they have kind of been growing and growing pretty fast. What you also see is credit cards didn't grow. I mean, in relative terms to what credit cards, they grew around 300%, but overall share of the market, that's not that big. So the number of individuals we are going to be tracking in this data set is close to 1 million people who are buying at this grocery store. Okay. So typically, if you think about empirical challenges in this kind of studies, is omitted variables. We don't know the socioeconomic status of the consumers, who they are. There could be omitted variables from the merchant side. Some of the merchants may not accept digital payments. Obviously, that's not the case in our setting. The supermarket chain accepts digital payments in all its stores, so we are able to track these people fairly well. There could be also this idea of reverse causality, where both if the merchant is accepting and consumers are willing to pay, consumers may often find that they don't want to pay, they want to continue paying cash, or they don't want to switch. So we'll talk about some of these challenges and how we will overcome that. Clearly, the demonetization itself helps us quite a lot, because the demonetization drained the currency in circulation and it affected people's ability to pay through cash. Okay. Our identification.
Sumit, let me
Yes.
do a little bit of placement here. You have 10 or 11 or 12 minutes. So just to be mindful of your time.
Okay, let me speed up. Okay, so we are going to use a fairly straightforward difference in difference strategy, and our control and treated group is the control group will be essentially people who used to use some credit or debit card, and treated group is essentially people who were using purely cash during this time. Okay, I'm going to skip this. This is fairly standard. Here is what happened for the control and treated group in terms of cash. You can see the control group. These are the mixed users of cash and debit. They essentially came back after demonetization. But if you look at the treated group in our sample, these are the guys who were using cash, only cash. Their usage never came back to cash fully. They went down to around 70%, and the cash usage came back to 80% subsequent to demonetization. If I look at the usage of their spending, the spending of the guys, our control group, really stayed flat, which is the red line. It stayed flat throughout. But of the treated group, essentially their spending. So this is the access spending these guys are doing essentially in our setting. Their spending went up. This goes back to my starting point that my son, he just doesn't use, he uses a plastic and he says, okay, I can just go out and just keep spending on this thing. I don't have a limit anymore. Okay, here is the regression results, which is essentially mimicking this graph that I'm showing you. This graph also kind of proves to you there is parallel trend. We don't need to worry about this. So cash usage dropped by around 33%. Level of spending goes up by around 230 or 240 rupees. If I try to put this in context, you can think about the rupee spending of the individual in our data goes up by around 120 rupees per month, or around 14% of their average spending at this store. We don't know everything else, but at least at this store, I can say this is what happened. Okay. If I try to break this down, where this spending is coming from, most of it is coming from the debit card. If I look at the mobile wallets, really there is no effect. Credit cards, there is no effect, even though there is a tiny negative coefficient. But remember, the base of the credit cards is very small in our settings anyway. Here's the dynamic effects. Earlier, I was just showing you the raw data. These are the regression coefficients from the dynamic regression we are running. You can see, obviously, cash usage drops and kind of stays flat. This is a diff and diff regression coefficient in a dynamic sense. And if I look at the log spending, that keeps going up throughout the sample period after the treatment. And that's exactly the point we are trying to make in the paper. Obviously, there could be issues because if we are using the full sample, if we exclude this time period from November 2016 to January, because that's where there was the forced withdrawal of unavailability of cash. So you might think our results are being driven by that fact that the people didn't have this choice to go back to cash. We can exclude the November to January data. Our results will go through. In fact, it may become even a little bit stronger. Okay. You may think, okay, by creating this treated group of fully cash users at the beginning, we may be biasing things in our favor. We can also exclude these fully cash users altogether and say, let's look at people who were using predominantly cash versus using not really much cash. Results are still there. If anything, they also become slightly stronger in the setting. The next thing we wanted to look at is where the spending is happening. Because we have very detailed data on their spending behavior, we can actually get into, is it on food items, not food items, and other non-food spending shares. A lot of this is happening on non-food spending. So essentially what they are buying, we can also get into that. Within non-food items, we can look at how are they spending this money, because we are claiming that these people are spending more money. Then the question is why? What are they doing with this? Are they buying more groceries? Are they buying more variety of groceries? Or are they buying better quality of groceries? Okay, I mean, the thought experiment is when I was using cash, I had this pain to pay from cash. I was always looking for bargains or the cheapest bananas or the cheapest noodles. But now I don't think about it as much. So when I'm buying it, I'm saying, okay, let me experiment or let me try this better noodles and see how they taste. And then I'm going to get used to buying these better quality noodles. And that's what you're kind of actually seeing. Product variety goes up, brand quality goes up, categorical variety goes up. So all these kind of measures, people are buying better quality trips. They're making more trips to the grocery store as well. Here is a visualization of what people are doing. You can see lots of things you can buy. We categorize them on how much sugar you were buying, what sandwiches, what breads, what nappies you were buying from this card, okay? Here, I'll try to move fast. So since I don't have that much time, here is another way to think about it. Are you
5 minutes.
More for unit price versus quantity versus amount? Because essentially what could happen that the quantity you are buying goes up, but what is happening is the unit price you're paying per quantity is going up. That says you're upgrading essentially in what you're purchasing. Okay. We did some heterogeneity of this response, and you can see that essentially the people who were using most cash before are the people whose spending goes up the most, and people who were using essentially the least cash before, their spending goes up the least. And it's pretty monotonic, okay? So essentially these cash users are the guys who are really looking into this and seeing how to use this. There are a bunch of alternative explanations for our results. There are 4 essentially we have thought about. Some income shock, that essentially these people got this income shock. The point of the income shock will not explain results, because the income shock in our setting is the opposite way it will go, because the income shock is trying to drain out this money from the economy, black money. So that will give us the opposite result. Credit supply, the banks may actually cutting down or increasing credit supply. Our results can't be explained by that because our results are not being driven by credit cards. They're mostly driven by debit cards. So credit supply is not something that will affect. Pricing policy, suppliers may change the pricing of these goods and services. Goods, that will also not explain because we don't see anything moving in there. Finally, this last point is something that people have talked about to us, that people may be moving from the informal sector. They used to go to the local wet market, and now they're going to this formal market, and that's why our results are there. We don't think so, because we are actually only looking at the people in our setting who were buying all the products that we are going to show you that they buy after demonetization, before and after in the same store. It's not they're migrating away from buying at a wet market before or the vendor machine somewhere else, and then they started buying that product in our setting. Now, I can't eliminate this thing that they obviously in India, there were people who were buying things in the informal sector, and now they moved to the formal sector. But at least our results in our setting, that's not the case. Okay. These are tables that kind of go through all these 4 exercises that I just talked about. Since Jigwa has given me little time, I'm going to skip these things and move on to one more thing. Jigwa, do I have a few more minutes?
Yeah, 2 or 3 minutes.
Okay.
Go.
Let me spend a couple minutes talking about mechanism, because this essentially goes to the either a rational kind of explanation or a psychological or a behavioral kind of explanation. I mean, rational explanation would be now I have to go to the cost of traveling to the ATM machines, risk of carrying cash, transporting this cash, this demand for money kind of a literature, what happens there. And the psychological literature is this point of pain. When you pay, it kind of makes you feel bad that, cash is leaving my hands. So we have a test here. What we look at is another online grocery store. This online grocery store, what it did is it allowed you to buy groceries, but when you could pay by cash or you could pay by debit card when it showed up at your home, okay? So essentially what we are trying to show you here is in this setting, in this online grocery store, the pain of this transaction cost is the same, essentially, because you're still going to pay cash when the delivery is happening at home. So there is no variation in the transaction cost, but even in this grocery stores, online grocery store setting, we still see spending going up for these people. So this is kind of telling us that there is some behavioral aspect to why people are spending more in our setting. Now, I can't completely shut the door of the transaction cost, but I can tell you this goes a long way in trying to explain our results on why these people were spending this way. So we do this exercise comparing our supermarket spending guys versus this online grocery spending guys. And we show you we can find similar results in cash drop it and spending increase in these 2 settings. Now, they're not comparable, obviously. This is not the same person, but we can show you comparable results, giving us some comfort that this behavioral aspect is at play. Okay, so let me try to conclude. Our goal was to show, do digital payments affect consumption? Why is this important? Because we know around the world, we are moving towards digital payment. China is pretty much fully digital. And the question is, does it have macro consequences? Are people now spending more as a result of that? In our setting, we use the demonetization in India to show that actually this has implications of how people spend. And it could have bigger implications going forward because we'll be having e-wallets, and these wallets are directly related to the merchants, and then merchants can use AI to figure out how to map your spending behavior to the products you want. So I think the effects will be even larger if we go look forward from these results. I'll stop here. Look forward to Filippo's discussion. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sumit.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to discuss, and I really enjoy reading the paper. I really enjoy also for once doing a discussion where you actually have more time, so you can try to engage with the material in a bit better. So it was really fun, as I said, to say, but let me start with this short summary. I mean, Sumit did a great job to present the paper. So the key question in this paper is essentially, how does the adoption of electronic payment affect consumer behavior? And they studied this in the setting of 2016 Indian demonetization. As Sumit explained before, what the key feature of the demonetization is that this was a large policy by the Indian government that essentially kind of, dramatically reduced the availability of cash in the economy, at least for a couple of months. So the basic idea here is that, we're interested in understanding how the use of electronic payment affect cash. Here, you have a situation where people switch to electronic payment, not because they want it, but potentially just because they're forced. And so it's kind of an ideal situation for an empirical research on this question. And, what is the basic identification they run? Well, essentially what they use is kind of a clever idea, which is they're going to compare people that before the demonetization were already using electronic payment. Those are kind of the control group in the sense that these people, they were already using debit card. And so they don't necessarily have to change much around the demonetization, to people that instead were using almost entirely cash. And they use, different version of this through the paper. And this identification assumption is essentially, this identification model is essentially two assumption. Number one, well, you need to have the household that are more dependent on cash will essentially kind of need to switch into electronic payment more extensively. And that's something they actually test. So that's something directly be testable, and they actually show evidence for this, and Sumit presented it in the presentation. And the other kind of assumption is to hold here is essentially the degree of dependence on cash will only affect household through essentially this payment channel, this change in electronic payment. And again, this is something that you technically cannot really test ex ante, but they essentially show robustness to kind of make us essentially careful about what they're actually capturing. And what data do they use? I mean, again, they talk about it, but the data it's really amazing when you think about it. They have data on this very large supermarket chain in India. And here, not only they know how much an household consume at the supermarket, obviously, but they also know kind of the breakdown across different payment technologies and cash. And they also have information on the product they buy. So really great data. I mean, really hard to kind of ask more from this dimension. And what are the kind of finding they have? Well, number one, they essentially find that the use of electronic payment increased around demonetization, but more interesting and unique of this paper, they find that actually households that were more dependent on cash increased consumption relatively more. And that this divergence happened exactly in November, persists over time, and it's mostly driven by essentially the use of debit card, and it's particularly strong for durable. And what's also is very interesting at the end is that they find that this increase in consumption, it's mostly driven by this behavioral response, this idea that consumer, essentially they feel less of a pain of paying when they use with a debit card rather than cash, rather than essentially cost saving, or like talks about as a transaction cost story. I was thinking about it more broadly as a convenience story. That doesn't seem to fit the data as well. Okay, so bottom line, I think it's a really, really interesting paper. But let me think a little bit about kind of the contribution here, and let me divide it between the contribution within the monetization and kind of more broadly. So if I think about within the monetization, I think the paper is very nice because it kind of like really kind of provide a bridge between different results that people have presented before. And here I'm going to be very self-serving in the sense that, I'm going to present, what I think is like two core results about the monetization in the literature. And one of them, obviously, as any good discussant, I'm going to pick one paper that I wrote. So if I kind of take kind of a general stand, I mean, on the one hand, you have, the paper of mine with Nicola Clousset and Apur Gupta, which essentially focus on the technology adoption of the demonetization. And our argument is that the demonetization kind of allowed the Indian economy to overcome coordination friction. And that's why we see such a large response in terms of electronic payment. On the other hand, there is another set of literature. And here I'm citing only the paper by Chodorach and co-author, but there is also other paper that essentially also showed that demonetization also caused a large negative effect on the Indian economy. But to some extent, the use of electronic payment kind of help and potentially reduce some of this negative impact. And why is this paper particularly nice? Because this paper essentially kind of bridge the micro technology story that I was mentioning in our paper in particular, with the kind of the aggregate result on the cost of a demonetization. In particular, what I thought it was really nice is it essentially showed that this group of people that potentially will be more affected by demonetization, people that essentially were using almost entirely cash, their consumption actually does not collapse. If anything, they actually find the consumption in relative term kind of increase. And so that kind of help kind of squaring why, for instance, in Children Rise, they kind of make such a big deal that the use of electronic payment allow kind of a smooth transaction from a more cash demanding economy to a situation where electronic payment were more important. And if you think more broadly about demonetization, I mean, this is also like a really, I think there is a lot to learn here. You know, there is a lot of novel insight of how households use electronic payment. But what I thought it was particularly nice is that, you know, they kind of highlight this kind of dark side of electronic payment that could lead to overconsumption, which is something I think, you know, people have been talking about, but they really have not good, you know, kind of evidence about it. So I think that's going to be an important result going forward. So bottom line, I thought the paper was really nice. There is amazing data. Again, this is obviously not an RCT, but the kind of identification and the analysis are very careful. And the question is very important. So, you know, a paper I recommend everyone to read, and they expect to kind of end up in a top journal. So let me just go through my comment, and the comment are going to be mostly on interpretation. So my first comment is really kind of big picture on interpretation. So the paper is framed an examination of the adoption of electronic payment on consumption. Okay, but obviously, you know, this is the kind of general question. You know, what's the identification? That's not, you know, identical. Which is, you know, what they do is that they kind of compare consumption change in around demonetization between these households that were more versus less dependent on cash before. And kind of one important issue is that obviously these households that are more dependent on cash, they're potentially going to be different. The households that are going to be less dependent on cash around the same time. And the question here is really not, I'm not really going to focus here about on kind of estimating themselves, but I'm trying to think more about kind of the interpretation of the result, broadly speaking. How does this different potentially affect how do we interpret our finding? Can everyone hear me? Because I saw some video got frozen. Yeah. Okay, perfect.
Yeah, we can hear you. We can hear you.
Perfect. I got scared. I saw my video frozen. I was like, oh my God. And so
you do need to be careful about your time.
Thanks. So, I mean, so what's that kind of the broadly setting here? So the paper focused mostly on what are the indirect channels through which the demonetization can affect the use of the consumption. And this indirect channel is essentially this idea that demonetization kind of cause adoption of electronic payment, which in turn can affect consumption. Okay. And so, you know, essentially, and that could come from transaction story, but also from a behavioral response. On the other end, I mean, demonetization could also have a direct effect on consumption. That's kind of, you know, in particular, this idea that demonetization may, you know, kind of impair the local economy and potentially could force you to kind of cut consumption. And how reasonable is this kind of general direct effect? Well, there is previous research that essentially show the direct effect is actually quite likely. I mean, this is again citing from my paper. In our paper, this is like very second order, and it's buried in appendix. But essentially, in the paper, we show that kind of household that live in area in which the demonetization was relatively larger as larger negative effect, they actually seems to cut consumption more. So this idea that demonetization could have a direct effect, again, and it's not unique in our paper, you know, Gabriel Reich and their co-author, they show kind of consistent evidence, is essentially there. So is there kind of any inconsistency between the positive effect of these more dependent on cash and our result? Well, absolutely not. The two papers kind of study very, very different margin. I mean, we exploit as well as most of the other paper kind of across district variation. In some area were more affected, some area less affected. What the author here do, they exploit kind of within district variation, and they compare within an industry. So kind of shutting down a lot of kind of dimension of heterogeneity, you know, do people more dependent and people less dependent kind of behave differently? So in a way, there is no really kind of inconsistent ex ante, but that doesn't mean that kind of ex post, you know, you may wonder like, isn't these people that are more dependent on cash exactly the people that would actually be more affected by demonetization? In this sense, you know, how do we frame the fact that we actually find them to be more positive affected? And this is, you know, in a way, particularly the case, because when you look at the result, and this is a figure that they show in the paper, essentially most of the variation is really coming from these people that were fully in cash and now increase their consumption, versus the people doing kind of mixed use of cash and electronic payment. They seems to be on balance. Essentially, they don't seem to be more affected on average. And again, this is really not a point about kind of internal validity, kind of the quality of the experiment, but try to think about like, what is the story that would essentially rationalize it? Because when you think about the story of people that were essentially using all cash, you need to start thinking about carefully about, essentially the difference between, is the treatment effect about capturing the change in the use of electronic payment, or there is also a component of adoption. And so if you think about this, I can try to potentially think different alternative story about what's really going on here. I mean, the first story is essentially these people that were fully in cash that now we see kind of increasing consumption more. Well, their story could be that they were already essentially having a debit card and now they just start using. This is a story like I have 3 debit credit card. I usually don't use one of them, but now, because I need it, I'm going to start using. In this case, maybe the switching costs are very limited. And so their experiment correctly kind of pinned down the specific effect on just the use of electronic payment and not the adoption part. Another story, though, is that these people that were fully using cash, they actually needed to adopt a debit card, but potentially this could happen at no cost. They were essentially able to go to the bank and get the debit card and start using it. And that would be another kind of ideal situation if they're really just interested on the use of the electronic payment, kind of isolating the adoption part. How likely is this second option? I mean, if you look at aggregate data, not super likely in the sense that around the monetization, this is just data from the kind of the aggregate data from the Central Bank of India. If you focus on the right panel, which is debit card, you actually don't see an increase in the issuance of new card. So we know there is an increase in the usage of debit card. This is very large, but essentially in terms of new debit card issuance, so adoption of debit card, there doesn't seem to be a big deal, in particular in November and December. There is a bit more in the new year. So again, if these people with no debit, that were fully in cash, did not have a debit card, it was probably not super easy for them to adopt. Which kind of gets me to the third point, which is the third alternative is that actually using debit card was actually expensive. And then that's important because essentially when we see their positive effect on consumption, well, that essentially potentially could be interpreted as essentially a lower bound, because these individuals, not only they kind of get affected positively by the behavioral response, assuming that's the channel we have in mind, but they also had to actually pay potentially to actually access the debit card. And so in general, I think it's kind of important to kind of think about what they think is going on here in terms of underlying story. Their estimates are perfectly fine, but what mechanism do they think is going on here to kind of explain? Are we in a situation where they think the only thing is changing the use of debit card, but people already had it, kind of consistent to some of the interpretation that Sumit had in the talk? Or do we think of this as essentially, a story about the adoption of electronic payment and the change in user? So how can they show this? Well, I think, first of all, what would be useful, and this is something similar, not identical to what they do, is that they could focus on these individuals that were already using electronic payment, but maybe a little bit, just maybe small fraction of their consumption. These people already had adopted electronic payment, but they just were not using. And compared to the people that were like using more extensively, do they still find the same magnitude? That would be insightful because that would tell you kind of isolating the kind of adoption part from the actual
you froze a little bit.
Yeah, can you hear me well though?
No, it's fine.
Okay,
going.
The second part is that it would be useful to know who are these also using the supermarket. Essentially, how does it compare to the typical Indian family in a way? I mean, in a way, I would actually kind of prefer if you tell me that these households are on average kind of medium income or upper income, and probably most of them already had debit card. In that case, kind of this idea that these people already had the debit card, they just didn't use it, would essentially be there. And third, I think what they should just recognize is that it's very possible that their estimate are actually just underestimation of the actual effect. Because if these people with full in cash are essentially also having to adopt electronic payment, and assuming this was actually expensive, part of their positive effect could actually be eaten up by the need to kind of switch to electronic payment and pay the kind of switching costs that are potentially non-trivial during this time. The second point I wanted to make is essentially about kind of demand versus supply of electronic payment. And so they show that the increase in consumption is mostly driven by debit card, in smaller part by mobile money, and essentially no effect in credit card. And the kind of issue is that the actual equilibrium decision kind of depends both on the demand and the supply of electronic payment. And the issue here is that, here they only have really one supermarket chain. So in a way, the supply is constant. That's really, really good from the standpoint of internal validity to the quality of the experiment. It's less good in terms of external validity. I mean, we don't really know whether this response heterogeneity between different form of payment would have been different if they had data from potentially a different type of vendor. Like, to make an example, like if they had data on a small chain of coffee shop, would we have seen still that most of the response is on debit card, or maybe in that case it was going to be more on mobile money. Similarly, if they had data on street vendor, relative to, for instance, having data on like an high-end clothing boutique in which maybe, people pay always in credit card. Again, this is a point specifically of the heterogeneity. It's not a problem for the rest of the paper, but when they essentially examine heterogeneity between electronic payment, they need to think about kind of this demand versus supply of electronic payment component. And what could they do here? Well, I think they should be more cognizant in the paper on, the interpretation is essentially conditional on them having observed only one retail chain. The other thing they could do, and again, it's not a big deal, it's just a matter of like kind of making it clear to the reader. The other thing they could potentially do, though, is that they could maybe have heterogeneity across store in what options are available. Again, they have many supermarkets, one chain, but many supermarkets. And maybe what they know is that certain supermarket has certain technology available and certain other, and that could be useful for kind of potentially kind of get to this question of demand versus supply a little bit more extensively. But in principle, again, this is not something first order if they interpret in the more consistent way. I then have 2 quick points on kind of the mechanism. So again, as Sumit kind of very well explained, their key mechanism is this behavioral response, is that if you switch and start using digital payment, then essentially payment are less salient and you end up spending more. One thing that they also find is that their effect, this is the result from a diff graph, is that their results are actually very persistent. If anything, the result actually a little bit increase over time. And I found this is a little bit puzzling because if the story is simply a story about overspending, I would expect that over time, people would learn about overspending. Like, if I end up spending more because I use credit card, maybe I don't realize it right away, but in the end of the month, I could realize it. And so at some point, I would have expected some sort of reversal. Kind of people learn from their mistake and they essentially adjust their behavior. So what could be going on here? Well, I think that, there potentially the story is not a simple story of just overspending. Maybe what they have to think a little bit more, it's a little bit more complicated story. So the 2 things came to mind. Maybe this is a story about overspending and kind of behavioral response in the short run, but with some form of habit formation in the long run. So these people were not really overspending in absolute term. They were overspending at the time relative to their preference. But now essentially, if I go into higher consumption level, my kind of preference change and I want to consume higher end goods. And then I stay there forever. That would be important because kind of the welfare implication of that is a little bit different. It's in a way potentially not as bad as just a pure overspending story. The other option that they have potentially is that, maybe it takes time to learn. And this is particularly the case if their results are driven by kind of an extensive margin, being essentially not buying, an extra coffee every day, but maybe buying like a large expensive good like a TV. Because if this is about kind of buying kind of one-off, very big expense, it may take actually more to learn, because then in the data, you need enough people to essentially done this big mistake. And then, that could not take, 1 month. And maybe some people do it in November, some people do it in December, some people maybe do it just in February. And that will take simply more to essentially kind of show up in the data. And so again, they should just try to be a little bit more kind of precise of what how do they really square their persistence with their behavioral story, which again is not inconsistent in principle, but they should kind of spell out better what they think is going on. And I think maybe potentially looking at whether this is driven by small expenditure, like every day I buy an extra coffee versus I buy a big TV, could be helpful, because I think if it's more a story about extensive margin, you could potentially take longer to see the result. The last point is really kind of an alternative mechanism. So give me 2 minutes and I'll quickly go through it. So again, I don't know to what extent this is true, but this kind of remind me a lot what Sumit said about is going shopping with his son. In a way, assume that there is a principal agent model here, where essentially you have a person in the family. I mean, what I had in mind was like the grandfather, which is the principal that kind of manage the finances of the family, decide how much to allocate money to different things. And you have an agent, which is the person that actually does grocery shopping, which is potentially the grandson. And in this type of model, cash has some optimal property. The optimal property of cash is that it allows to kind of pre-commit on expenditure. Now, in a way, like if I know I need to buy coffee and sugar, I know it costs $5. I tell my grandson, you know, buy coffee and sugar, this is $5, and I don't have to worry about it. Instead, if you have electronic payment, you know, this pre-commission doesn't work as well, because I have to give my grandson the debit card, and then he could potentially go to the store, buy coffee, sugar, but also a soccer ball. And then it will take me at least until the end of the month to kind of figure it out that he overspent. And so in this situation, essentially monitoring becomes more difficult. And you could find situation in which essentially now the principal and the agent kind of potentially are getting involved in different way. You know, in the example of the grandfather and the grandson, maybe now the grandfather has to go to the grocery shopping with the grandson, and that potentially changes the type of consumption they do. So again, kind of the broadly speaking, what I have in mind is that, you know, the fact that now you use debit card instead of using cash may change the way you're doing shopping, and in particular, the type of person and the number of people that are involved into shopping. And again, is that plausible? Like, I don't know. I think if they could, you know, dig more in the data about this, that would be kind of interesting. I mean, to me, again, the main question is, who is really the principal and agent in this kind of setting? That would be kind of, it's more like, you know, to some extent, it's a sociological question about who does grocery shopping in India, and then did it change around demonetization? But I also think, like, if they have data, it would be great to kind of know who actually is conducting the shopping. So I don't know exactly how the store kind of identifies the individual that does grocery shopping. Do they have any data about, you know, is this person X or is the person Y? It would be nice to kind of know if the person kind of is changing across the sample period. Maybe that's not possible, that's fine. But if it's possible, that would be very interesting. And the other question, again, they show that is this change in the composition of the goods sold. And I wonder to what extent that could be also driven partially by the fact that now the type of person doing the grocery shopping is different. And this could be partially just, you know, now if I go with my wife, well, I would buy different things than my wife alone, and vice versa. Or it could partially be now if I go with my wife, you know, what before I would buy potentially to a different store, I buy to the supermarket. And as Sumit mentioned, they do a very good job to kind of rule out that this is, the result is not about reallocation from the informal to the formal sector, but to the extent that this is just reallocation within the formal sector, I think maybe that could be, you know, if there is a change in composition, that would be a little bit more of a concern. Again,
Filippo, 2 minutes.
I am essentially done.
Good.
So what's the bottom line here? Well, again, I think the paper is really interesting. It presents a lot of novel evidence of how household behavior can be affected by the adoption of electronic payment. The data is amazing. The empirical work is very, very sound, and the results are credible and actually very interesting. So this is, I think, a paper that will that I recommend everyone to read. In particular, obviously, if you're interested in this literature. If I think about kind of, you know, next stage, and the paper is already very polished, but kind of thinking a little bit more about the interpretation, not really kind of changing the result in any way, but kind of thinking about, you know, what's the exact story they have in mind. And, you know, is this a shock that kind of affect, kind of just change in habits about consumption and the use of electronic payment, or there is also kind of an adoption story? It's important to kind of think about the magnitude of the result. But in general, again, this is already kind of a very, very nice paper. So I'm looking forward to just see how this is gonna move forward. So I thank you very much for the author, but also thank you very much to organize it. It was very nice to presenting here, and I'm actually done. Thanks again.
Thank you, Filippo, for the very detailed discussion. So what I'm gonna do is to add one comment on that, some question, and then let Sumit to respond. And then that if in the audience there are some other questions, please just type in. I did see one question. Tianyue already responded. So let me add one question, which is, you know, in a way that I knew this literature, there are existing papers somehow they're a little bit inconsistent in some implications. This is why Filippo was mentioning. But I want to ask you that in your data, one big supermarket chain, if you repeat the existing, like Filippo, what they're doing on district level, do you also see that within, for this particular biggest supermarket chain, the district where, whatever they define as a larger shock, do also experience worse consumption outcomes, or growth is lower? If that's not the case, then it's basically that you need to think about it. Is this supermarket chain market chain is a special, different from the somewhat the aggregated trend? Okay, Sumit, can you want to respond?
So let me take on your question first. Obviously, this is something we have thought about quite a lot, because both Filippo and the other paper have used this kind of identification to figure out the amount of money that was being deposited in these districts. The issue for us is, obviously we have done it, we have the results, and Tianyue can validate, we find similar evidence, but we don't have enough districts. I mean, you need around 400 districts to kind of add that variation to exploit it. We only have around 20 plus, because most of our data is coming from the urban areas. So we can't do this. Hence, we try to show you the results within districts comparing two people. Okay. To me, that's a better test of this. I think Filippo would agree. Let me go on to Filippo's points of 3 points. I mean, I really like your comment on this habit formation, which is kind of suggesting that, look, there could be behavioral response, then why is it not being undone? Even dumb people should learn sometimes. And why are they not learning? Maybe there is some habit formation that can happen. I like it. I think that's something we should think about. But intra-family shopping, I think that's interesting. That's something I've always thought about. Obviously, I bring in my son to my story. I don't think that could be explaining. One thing we can do in the data, because for some people, we know who's actually doing the shopping. Not for all, we know for some people have given us the data of who the shopper is, essentially. So we can track those people and see if the same person is coming in, okay? So we can actually do something to that point of yours and show you. The other answer I would have is, because we have this data from this other online grocery store as well, and we find the results there. So this argument you had earlier about external validity, I think can be solved from using that data, not just this one grocery store. This also goes to Jigwa's point, is this grocery store special? We show you that we bring a data from another completely different grocery store, and we can show you similar evidence. To your point of this, not mechanism, supply versus demand, obviously what helps us is JDY, because JDY pushed in 500 million people to adopt debit cards. And that's what shows that these people just use the debit card. This debit card was just sitting around. They was not being used forever. Mainly people like cash, typically it could be black money, it could be other reasons, but they like cash. And now they realize, oh, that debit card that was hanging around, might as well start using it because it's worth it now. I don't have, and now that I get used to it. You can argue the policymakers had this motive in their mind to push digitization, is to first issue the debit card, then do demonetization and piggyback on both of them to get people to adopt more of them. The first point that you made, which is interesting, that look, what happened is you took away cash. You're talking about cash users. Now they didn't have an inventory. They needed to have a stock of rice and toilet paper. They depleted it in those 2 months. And now all of a sudden you see this increase in spending of these guys. It's natural because 2 months later they got cash. They had to stock up everything. And that's what you're showing me. But our results are persistent. They're persistent for many months after that. So the idea that you have is they would have to stock up. That should just die down after a month or two when they have actually stocked up all their groceries again in their pantry. Okay, but something we should think about, at least discuss in the paper. So I really like your discussion. I mean, all points are very valid. It just only enhances the paper. So I can thank you very much for doing a great job.
Can I add one point here?
Yes.
Yeah, so on the habit formation, that's a good point, and that's also distinguishes the debit card with credit card. See, the learning happen with credit card spender because you get a statement at the end of the month. For debit card, absolutely, there is no statement. It kind of, unless you ask the bank to send your statement or you go online, there is no monthly statement comes to you to pay. So your learning may happen maybe after 4 months, I'm looking at my bank statement, and that's when I learned that I have spent too much on my debit card. So that's the basic difference why the learning doesn't happen using debit card so fast.
Good point.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask a simple clarification question. I want to thank the authors, and the discussions is really beautiful and very, very a great seminar. There's a question in my mind that you must have handled. I just somehow escaped my attention on how you explain it. The demonetization is to flush out, to get rid of some of the informal activities. So if it is successful, then I am the person who in the past used cash. But those that use a lot of cash are those that frequent a lot of the informal activities. And now the informal activities are being flushed out. So I bring my consumption to the formal shop. You must have thought about this. So how do you explain that way?
So one of the alternative explanation is exactly that story that you have in mind. And we kind of test this idea. So a simple way to test this idea would be the following exercise. Let's eliminate people who used to buy groceries not at this store, and now we see them buying groceries at this store. Okay, then that story could hold water because now I see somebody after demonetization used to buy fish and other things in the wet market, but now they all of a sudden start buying it at the store. Then that informal story can hold water. But what we are showing you is they used to buy the fish and everything at this store before and after all along. So it's not that their spending increased because they were not buying certain items before. What we are showing you is when they buy fish at this store, the quality of the fish they buy or the variety of the fish they buy now at this store is better. That's more like what Filippo had in mind of his, inter-family thing. That, what the grandson now goes and says, the father used to buy me this cheap chocolate. Let me buy this more expensive chocolate because he's not around. I would think I'm more sympathetic to that could be at play. But obviously that's something we have kind of shown you in other data than as opposed to something like informal moving to formal.
But Sumit, I'm still a little bit not fully satisfied. I upgrade my purchase. It's because the available informal market become not available. And so the bad chocolates is not available. So I have no choice.
No, so I thought the story you have in mind is that I used to buy the bad chocolate somewhere else, but now I'm going to buy it here. What I'm saying is you were always buying the bad chocolate here, but now you're just buying better chocolate here.
There must be some extensive form here, extensive margin to adjust. I would guess, right? So in the sense that I like the example of Bernie, which is that I think about the supply side of these fake products, whatever those things, and that's really wholesale side. And if that's completely shut down, then that's gonna affect you trickle down to the retail side, and then that where your effect might pick up. And that's also consistent with
Let me try to answer this in a slightly different way, Jigwa.
Mm-hmm.
I think if that was only the story, you would have seen this effect in a very short term. Okay.
That's also true. Yes.
Okay. And we are
so why is it short term?
I think so.
Because these guys will come back. It's not these guys, these informal sector will just disappear forever. They disappeared for a couple months because there was no cash available. But then after 2 months, cash came back, and all these informal guys were again in the economy serving.
It's sort of like, say I'm in New York City, and the police come and just write out all those illegal fake merchandise, and it's all gone. So I have no choice but to go into formal shops.
No, but can I come in?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, please.
Yeah. So in this case, it's a little different. See, cash 500 and 100 rupees are bared. So that doesn't mean that the local Kirana stores will be out of the business. So what the local Kirana stores has done, they started giving items in credit, which basically means when you get the new bills from your ATM, you pay me after a month, after 2 months. So a lot of the Kirana stores goes by credit, like usual credit, not credit card. And that got extended in this scenario. So if I am buying a banana from a Kirana store down my housing complex, I'm still doing it. And basically, instead of paying him instantly cash, I'll be paying him after a month. And he just does the bookkeeping. So that's happened a lot post demonetization for a month or two.
But those results cannot, I mean, I agree, even if that was not the case, what Pulak explained is exactly what happens in India. Imagine if we can't prove that in the data. What we can prove in the data is, look, this is a persistent effect for months and months. So these people are buying from the store. And secondly, we show you that they were always buying the banana in this store, and now they're buying a better banana in this store.
So we don't have too much time. So before leaving, I thought that this demonetization is very short term in terms of the policy, and then revert. What's happening now in India now?
Oh, India, I think people have forgotten demonetization. Right now, everybody's talking about COVID and the implications.
Fine. but does the electronic payment, had a very significant bump because of that?
Pulak can tell you more, but electronic payment, especially
I think the mobile payment has gone up substantially.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I think Filippo mentioned that actually these shocks serve, overcome the coordination frictions. So after it's overcome, I think there's persistence in the effect. And we also find that our sample is not that long, only lasts until September 2017. We still see that a lot of the forced switch to digital payments did not fully revert. So I guess we also show the persistence in digital payment use in the consumer side.
I'm if I may, sorry, I'm taking up so much airtime.
Last question.
Is a big picture question. After this demonetization, what happened to the savings rate, and what happened to the Indian population's involvement in formal transaction activities, banking activities, and so on? I think that is the original intent of the policy, right? So yes, COVID hits, but what happened? What happened to India? Used to have an extremely high savings rate, right?
So, savings rate is it's a good question. I don't think we have formally looked at it. Informally looking at the newspaper articles and things, the savings rate has been going down in India. Okay, but that's again proves our point or supports our hypothesis. Because people are overspending, where is that money coming from? Some of this has to be coming from reduced savings.
And there's the motivation of my question.
Yes.
All right. So this is a great paper today. We get to know a lot about what's happened in India. Next, our series will be 2 weeks from now, July 15th. The paper will back to China. It's on non-performing loans by Tianyue. That she's one of the co-authors and the Ben. The discussant will be Changtai Xie from University of Chicago. We are looking forward to the next seminar, and thanks all for continuing support to our series. Thank you.
I'll take the chance to thank everybody. This is wonderful. It's very stimulating and I learned a lot. But it also showcased one point that we want to have more than just, we want to have multiple countries experience. So I enjoy the Indian experience. I want to see other countries' experience as well, because this is a very important topic about the development of the capital market. Thank you very much.